Take Me for a Ride, Coming of Age in a Destructive Cult by Mark Laxer. Reading by Mark Laxer. Chapter 2. Zapped. "Lights," said my father, and for a moment, except for the phosphorescent hands of the clock on the wall, the room went black. With a flip of a switch, he suddenly reappeared, a tall, thin man with thick glasses, standing beside the glowing enlarger. As a child, I sat for hours under a dim yellow light, mesmerized by images appearing on paper submerged in trays filled with smelly liquid. Yellow, my father taught me, has no apparent effect on the light-sensitive specks coating photographic paper. The unorthodox images which leapt from the walls of our house seemed as eerie as the darkroom experience itself. There was a photograph of a llama's head as viewed through a distorting fisheye lens. There was a photograph of a shredded poster of a man's face. And there were many abstract photos which seemed to defy description. My father, a production manager at a New York publishing company, perhaps saw the world in a different light than his peers. My mother was an elementary school teacher with black hair, sometimes kind, sometimes intense eyes. A generous and caring woman, she put her career on hold for more than a decade to raise a family. She met my father in upstate New York on a hike sponsored by an outing club. When I was 14, I sensed that my father was growing tired, detached, and depressed, but I did not understand why. He expressed abstractions better than emotions, and found it difficult to vent the angers and frustrations which had accumulated from work and from home. Nor did I understand that my mother freely gave to me what she in her youth had sorely missed, love. Oblivious to the magnitude of her workload, she taught full-time and was pursuing a master's degree. I grew angry with her as a teenager, partly because she seemed insecure and overbearing, and partly because she expected me, my brother, and my father to help keep the house clean in the way that she wanted. Despite my family's love for the outdoors, for our dog, and for one another, the emotional fabric that bound us together often seemed on the verge of ripping apart. And the problems only intensified as my brother and I grew older. 2.5 years my elder, my brother was an avid backpacker and rock climber with jet black hair, Gandhi glasses, and a gentle but determined disposition. He too felt that something in our family was out of whack, and we occasionally discussed what we would do when we left home. But unlike me, he had no one to buffer him from my parents, who, I was starting to discover, were only human. I was a sensitive child. I was so sensitive that the sounds of someone chewing made me upset. I was a light sleeper. I was also a slob, a knee-jerk rebel, and something of a nerd when it came to doing things like making friends with girls. Nonetheless, I decided that I could work out whatever I needed to work out in a healthier environment than at home. The countdown to the last day of high school, after which I planned to set out on my own, began when I was around 15. Meanwhile, I read a lot and spent time with friends, some of whom also enjoyed hiking and bicycling. In the summer of 1976, when I was 16, I bicycled from the White Mountains of New Hampshire to Boston with people from an outing club. One morning, as I watched my traveling companions prepare their daily dose of hallucinogens, I realized that I wanted to be part of their fellowship. The desire, however, was checked by a gut-level impulse to avoid drugs. So Jim, a sinewy guy stooped over a pot of boiling morning glory seeds, turned me on instead to the teachings of Don Juan, a Yaqui way of knowledge. This was a popular account of Carlos Castaneda's purported apprenticeship with Yaqui Indian medicine man Juan Matus, or Don Juan. From the cover of the book peered a menacing and surreal painting of a crow. "But a crow isn't always a crow," said Jim softly, paraphrasing Don Juan as he stirred the seeds. "Sometimes it's a powerful saucer in disguise." Intrigued by the paradox of the crow, I plowed through the teachings of Don Juan and through Castaneda's A Separate Reality and Journey to Ixtlan. At summer's end, still drugless and clueless as to whether crows were birds or saucers, I left Boston clutching a Castaneda book. Back in New York, I chose to see the world less through the eyes of an 11th grader taking honors physics and history, and more through the eyes of a saucer's apprentice. I incorporated into my daily routine Don Juan's recommendations. As an exercise in humility, I spoke aloud to plants. To see beyond society's description of reality, I tried to stop my thoughts. To expand my awareness beyond the confines of the waking state, I sought to wake within a dream. My interest in what lay beyond the scope of traditional reality led to an interest in what lay beyond the scope of traditional education. And that fall, I thought about switching to a public experimental high school founded in the late 60s. I firmly believed that I would thrive in a world without grades, attendance taking, tests, and requirements. In January 1977, with the guidance of my brother, I managed to persuade my reluctant parents to let me join. I chose to continue taking physics and history at the traditional school. Other subjects I took at the non-traditional school, where, in a creative writing class, I wrote, "Teachers force us to perceive the surface world of reason. A tree is but a pole with leaves whose habits change each season." I thrived within a self-designed, academically rigorous educational program, but experienced no breakthroughs in my search for hidden realms of perception until the following summer. The experience came when I was working 10-hour days and 5.5-day weeks on a farm in southern New Hampshire. In my spare time, I was designing and building an electricity-producing windmill, which ended up towering some 20 feet above Onyx, one of the tallest cows. Farm crew members sometimes walked out to the hayfields to get high. One night, after smoking marijuana, I fell asleep and later saw, above where I lay, a cow, its head swaying gently to and fro. Though I thought I was awake, it was but a dream, for when I woke from waking, the cow had disappeared. This experience led me to believe that, like Mr. Castaneda's mentor, I could consciously direct my actions within the context of a dream. Back in New York, I became editor-in-chief of the high school newspaper. I soon learned that I had a knack for inspiring and for managing a team. I was well regarded by my teachers and by my peers, and I had many friends. I could have continued my studies at a prestigious university, but I longed for a mystical quest. I dreamt that I walked silently across a vast desert plain. I longed to experience that which lay beyond the surface world of reason. I dreamt that I flew over desert chaparral into an infinite orange horizon. I longed for a wisdom that was secret, magical, ancient. I decided to hitchhike alone to the Sonoran Desert in Mexico to find a mystical teacher, a brujo, who was just like Don Juan. I planned to leave on the day after high school graduation. Meanwhile, I continued to read the Castaneda books and to experiment with consciousness. One time, I attempted to raise my right arm without consciously lifting it. I wanted it to levitate on its own. I soon felt a tingling in the arm, but it did not rise. Finally, I lifted it on purpose. Then, as part of the experiment, I suggested to myself that the arm remain lifted. As long as I repeated the suggestion, the arm remained where it was. Afterwards, I could not recall how long the state of mind had lasted. My brother shared with me an interest in rising above the limitations of home, school, religion, society, and reality. By the time I turned him onto the Castaneda books, he had already studied Einstein's special theory of relativity and the Tao of physics. In the spring of 1978, when he was studying physics at the State University of New York at Stony Brook, he told me that he'd met an English professor who was an expert on the Castaneda books. He knew that my quest for a teacher would begin in roughly 2 months, when I would graduate from high school. He wanted to help me. He suggested that I attend the Castaneda expert's free lecture series on meditation in Manhattan. I wondered why a Castaneda expert would live on Long Island rather than in a remote desert in Mexico. But my brother's enthusiasm was sincere. Besides, I thought, as we rode the train into the city, anything I learn now will only help me on the journey. We arrived at a building on 33rd Street. A rickety elevator took us to the 3rd floor, where the sweet and spicy aroma of incense wafted through the air. I saw a row of sneakers by the elevator and wondered if they'd been responsible for the incense. After placing our sneakers in line with the others, we walked past a sign which read, Yoga Life Perfection. A young woman with long black hair and a playful, impish grin sold books and incense in the hallway. She recognized my brother and smiled at us. She wore a sari. We entered a medium-sized room where a smoldering stick of incense and 2 unlit candles rested on a table up front. 2 young women stood together near the back of the room. One had long brown hair and dreamy eyes. The other had a face and figure like a model. Their faces were flushed and aglow. They also wore saris. Too bad I'm not going to be sticking around New York, I thought, gazing at them. In the audience sat 2 women in their 60s, dressed entirely in black. They sat near a man in his 30s with the frame of a metal pyramid resting squarely on his head. We sat by the 2 sari-clad women. They were clearly excited about something. They used words like inspiration, aspiration, concentration, visualization, meditation, reincarnation, and perfection. My brother, too, seemed excited, as if something extraordinary and wonderful were about to occur. With each passing minute, I found myself growing more curious, more impatient, and more excited. 15 minutes after the talk was scheduled to begin, the women in sari stopped talking and looked up. I looked up, too, and saw a tall man with a projecting nose and lush locks. His long strides seemed synchronized with his arms, which swung like perfectly conflicting pendulums. This motion seemed to propel him into the room. He sat on the table facing the audience, folded his legs in the pretzel-like posture seen in Buddha statues, and introduced himself as Dr. Frederick Lenz. He explained that he had another name, Atmananda. Then he lit the candles and asked us to drop our preconceived notions because meditation is beyond thought. Thought is like a car, he said in a smooth, charming voice. You can drive it to California, but if you want to cross the ocean, you'll need an alternate means of transportation. If you want to cross the sea of consciousness, you will need meditation. Though his metaphors were new to me, They seemed to point the way beyond the surface world of reason. He used words like guru, avatar, warrior, power, power spots, personal power, moments of power, spiritual power, psychic power, ecstasy, enlightenment, cosmic love, transcendental, supreme nirvana, and the infinite. When he said it was time to meditate, I was surprised that he'd been speaking for over 40 minutes. It had seemed like 5. Now, extend your index fingers and close your eyes, Atmananda instructed. I squinted to see if anyone else was speaking. From what I could tell, the 20 or so people obeyed him. Now say me out loud and touch your chest. My me was muffled by the group's me. You are not only pointing to your chest, Atmananda explained, but to your heart chakra, one of 7 psychic energy centers associated with the subtle body. Concentrating on a chakra is an easy way to begin crossing the sea of consciousness. So we sat there drifting, and though I tried to stop my thoughts and feel the throbbing pulse of my heart chakra, I found myself checking out the women in saris. Very good, he said after about 5 minutes. Then he suggested that we sit back, relax, and ask questions. There was something hauntingly familiar about this confident, well-spoken young professor. Perhaps it was the way his chin jutted forward, the rich timbre of his voice, or his seeming interest in helping people that reminded me of the cartoon character Dudley Do-Right. I felt drawn to him. I found myself staring into his full moon gripping eyes. I found myself seeking his attention. Can a person be healed by meditating? I asked, only partly concerned that I had a cold. He locked my attention with those eyes. I felt slightly dizzy. It was not unpleasant. It felt as though I were floating. My vision blurred. Things went fuzzy and white. It appeared as though it were snowing. Am I having a vision? I wondered, and immediately the snow vanished. Just then, Atmananda seemed unreal, like a superhero from a cosmic comic strip that had been cut, enlarged, and inserted into the room. When he smiled at me, I had the uncanny sense that he knew what I had felt and seen. Then he left, flanked by the women in saris.